Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody's fed up and not too comfortable. We don't want anybody drifting off for the afternoon here. Welcome to the start of the afternoon session. My name is Dave Quist. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Marriage and Family Canada, and we're very pleased to be sponsoring our keynote speaker for this afternoon. The IMFC exists to present credible, research-based evidence to governments, media, and in fact all Canadians in support of strong mom and dad marriage and family life. We believe that Canada's decision makers need to have the most accurate information available in order to answer questions such as, what is the impact of democratic changes in Canada today? How does education impact our children and families today? Is there a connection between strong families and strong economy? The answer to that one is yes. Can we afford full-day kindergarten? And are there any positive outcomes? The answer to that is no, we can't, and very few. Furthermore, we cannot separate fiscal and social policy. Each impacts the other. Witness the current debate over old age security and demographics right now. Solving these problems takes greater research and innovation than most governments are able to offer today. And social policy innovation is what the IMFC can assist with. At your table settings today, or at your chairs rather, is our 5th anniversary book, which we distributed last year. It tells of our history, our work, and our future plans. We'd love to support your work through our research. Stop past our booth today, take those booklets with you, stop past and say hello. If you're not receiving our publications, we'd love for you to come and sign up. Go to our website, imfcanada.org, and sign up online. And if you don't like the look of our website when you get there, don't worry. We don't either. And so we're actually redoing that right now, and I'm going to cross my fingers and say that we're actually trying to launch that later today. Or sorry, later this month. Later today, I'd have people upset with me pretty quick. And now the man that you've actually come to hear today. Dr. Marvin Olasky is a man that's not afraid to speak up on topics that others have shied away from. He's had an extended teaching career. He's a distinguished author or co-author of over 25 books, including Compassionate Conservatism, The Religions Next Door, Abortion Rights, and Transforming Welfare. He's the editor-in-chief and founder of World Magazine and holder of the Distinguished Chair in Journalism and Public Policy at Patrick Henry College. Dr. Olasky earned his undergraduate from Yale University in 1971 and a PhD in American Culture from the University of Michigan in 1976. He's been married for 35 years, has 4 sons. He's written over 2,800 articles for publications ranging from World Magazine, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post. Professor at University of Texas at Austin for over 2 decades, and provost of the King's College, New York City from 2007 to 2011. He's also a senior fellow at the Accident Institute, has been a foster parent, a PTA president, informal advisor to George W. Bush, and a Little League assistant coach. I guess with 4 boys, that sort of comes naturally, doesn't it? Philanthropy magazine called Dr. Olasky's The Tragedy of American Compassion one of the 8 books that changed America. Will you please join me in welcoming and giving him a warm Canadian welcome to Dr. Marvin Olasky. Welcome. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. 4 decades ago, when I was 21, just graduated from college, I decided to bicycle across the United States. I started in Boston, kept going until I reached the city in Oregon where I was going to work in a newspaper. And wanting to go pretty much in a straight line, I bicycled across upstate New York and entered Ontario at Niagara Falls. That was my first time in Canada. I kept bicycling and eventually re-entered the United States and Michigan and kept going, made it. But there was one day I stopped at an old wooden fort, or a reconstruction of one. You may know which one it is. I couldn't quite find it on an atlas now, but it had signs describing its history during what in the United States we call the War of 1812. And there I read about American aggression and about how the marauding invaders were stopped by brave Canadians. I learned at that point, and I've tried to remember, that Canadians do not like to take advice from Americans. And so I'm here really not so much to offer it, but to report on the American experience and perhaps allow you to make some connections between that and the Canadian experience. Three parts to what I want to talk about today. First, some U.S. history. Second, where we are now south of the border concerning welfare. And then third, where we may be going. Start with some quick history. The United States from the 17th century up through really the 1920s had a war on poverty that was far more successful than the war on poverty that began to be waged from Washington in the 1960s. The warriors were not governmental officials. They were thousands of local, private, charitable agencies and volunteers, religious groups to a large extent, all across the country. They did not abolish poverty, but they did help millions out of poverty, including my own grandparents. Then other people, new immigrants came in, presented new needs, but there were always springs of fresh water flowing at that point. People were able to move out of poverty. And that's been very different from the American experience of the past several decades, where we have tended to have multi-generational welfare dependency. In a sense, blocks of ice rather than flowing water. We've had always winter but never Christmas in many poor areas of our country. And the groups that were successful in fighting poverty during this first war on poverty, from colonial times up to the 1920s, were groups that offered help that was challenging, personal, and spiritual. Those were the three crucial dimensions. They pushed people to work. They provided mentors for people who were poor, who would help them find a job and stay in one. They helped the self-image of these individuals by showing them that, in fact, they are created by a wonderful God who created them with the ability to do great things. This was very different than our own experience of past decades. That experience really began in the 1930s in the United States during the Depression. Politicians described the Depression as a plague that would run its course. So welfare coming out of the national government in Washington was supposed to be a temporary measure. The agency in charge was the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. The Bureau of the Budget Director at that time, a fellow named Lewis Douglas, warned very emphatically that thousands of people would settle into government-made jobs if the programs were long-lasting, but they would not be real jobs. They would not teach people real work and the effort needed to get into that and to progress. And the result, according to Lewis Douglas, would be long-term economic collapse. President Franklin Roosevelt became the chief executive in 1933. He was a proponent of a much larger government, but he himself acknowledged the danger of welfare programs becoming a habit with the country. Again, they were supposed to be temporary. In November 1933, Franklin Roosevelt said, "When any man or woman goes on a dole, something happens to them mentally. The quicker they are taken off the dole, the better it is for them the rest of their lives." In 1935, Franklin Roosevelt argued we must preserve not only the bodies of the unemployed from destitution, but also their self-respect, their self-reliance, their courage, and determination. And he noted, in the business of relief, we are dealing with properly self-respecting Americans to whom a mere dole outrages every instinct of individual independence. Most Americans want to give something for what they get. That something, in this case honest work, is the saving barrier between them and moral disintegration. We propose to build that barrier high, end quote. And this again from Franklin Roosevelt, the leading proponent of the developing welfare state. And in the 1930s and the 1940s and the 1950s, to a large extent, that barrier was kept high. Welfare was still seen as something temporary and something that was designed to help people get to work as quickly as possible rather than enable them to stay off work for the rest of their lives. That changed with the social revolution of the 1960s in the United States. And from then, really up until the mid-1990s, officials did not keep that barrier high. In fact, they kept lowering, and instead of offering challenging, personal, spiritual help, they emphasized entitlement, enabling people to stay poor. In the 1960s, they started banning any mention of God from any type of poverty programs. Government organizations enabled people to stay poor instead of challenging them to come out of poverty. Now, there were many U.S. Republican opponents of welfare from the 1960s to the 1980s. They complained about the cost of welfare, but they underemphasized that issue of moral disintegration that had been spoken about in the 1930s. I started researching this issue, about 25, 30 years ago. I heard American conservatives complaining about the overall cost in dollars, but not the cost in human lives. And they were not very effective politically. The conservatives, the Republicans at that point, did not emphasize the problem that welfare created among the recipients, that it enabled people to take what could have been perhaps a safety net and turn it into a rather frazzled hammock. This was wrong. And not until we started saying that this was wrong, not because of the money, although that is a factor, but because of the human cost. Not until then did in the United States did we start having success in changing the welfare system. My 4 sons and I had dogs as pets. We put food in their bowls. We let them lie or run around all day. That was fine for dogs. But for years, we treated welfare recipients in the United States the same way. And that is not fine for people made in God's image, capable of working and helping others. Now, in 1995 and 1996, we turned a corner because we talked about the cost in human lives. A Republican Congress in 1996 passed welfare reform and started emphasizing getting people into jobs and not treating them like animals. We had 80 different welfare programs. The most famous was food stamps. People would use these to buy food at markets. The food stamp participation rate, the percentage of those eligible who actually enrolled, had jumped from 31% in 1976 to 75% in 1994. And again, they were eligible for it, but for a long time it was considered honorable in the United States not to do it, not to take food stamps unless you really needed them. That all changed. So you started to have a majority of people eligible taking food stamps and going up to 75% in 1994. That fell to 52% by the end of the decade, from 1995 to the year 2000. It fell from 75% to 52% because there started to be an emphasis once again on work. You're capable of working, you should be working. The number of food stamp recipients fell from 28 million to 17 million, largely because there was a sense of jobs being important. Not important just economically, but important in terms of who we are as human beings made in God's image. 2/3 of the people who left welfare found jobs. Only 1 in 5 went back onto welfare. And the results were so clear that in the year 2000, President Bill Clinton, who had opposed welfare reform and then signed it into law in 1996 because of various political reasons leading in a presidential campaign at that point, Bill Clinton himself bragged in a speech, quote, "If I had said we'll cut the welfare rolls in half, you wouldn't have believed it. But we know now, because of the success our country has had, that if we work together and we set common goals, we can achieve them." And indeed, those goals were set, those goals were achieved, and most people, they went to work and their children learned to seeing parents. They learned our parents work, and we ourselves should learn to work. The problem, though, is that the underlying mentality of many government officials had not changed. Starting in 2001, they began to use every opportunity they had to get more people back onto welfare. And when the U.S. economy turned sour in 2008, that drive continued. Use of food stamps, the name of the program is now changed to Supplemental Nutrition Aid, because the idea is it is supposed to be supplemental. People are supposed to be working. It went from, again, it had declined to 17 million in 2001. It's now up to 46 and perhaps even 47 million, 1 out of every 7 Americans. And most of that growth was before 2008, when economic times were still good. And that was during a Republican administration, but the officials and the governmental programs really wanted to get more people on welfare, and there wasn't much supervision, political supervision, I suppose you could say. And so they were allowed to do what they wanted to do. They thought welfare is a very good thing. This is what we are all entitled to, and anyone who is entitled to it should sign up for it. Now, that's the past. Again, this period of change in 1995 and 1996, real improvement over the next 5 years, and then back to the same old over the past decade. And that brings us to part 2, the present. Again, I'm not arguing against welfare in some limited circumstances. I was in Houston recently, spoke with a woman named Jean Solis. 7 years ago, she was 48. She had a 10-year-old daughter. She lived in a battered women's shelter, and she reluctantly joined the millions on welfare. She says, "I needed food stamps to feed my daughter." She worried about her daughter's perceptions. She worried, well, what am I teaching her when I don't stand up for myself? but she received training at a place in Houston called the Work Faith Connection. It's a Christian program in Houston, and she was able to, from there, to gain a full-time job in 2008, and she kissed food stamps goodbye. In fact, she says, I stopped on April 1st, 2008. That was a good day for me. So for Jean Solis, welfare worked the way it was supposed to work. Temporary help that saved her and her daughter from destitution, gave her time to get on her feet. But I also, in Houston that same day, I was talking with a man, Scott Wesley. At age 20, while heavily using cocaine and alcohol, he impregnated his girlfriend. Over the subsequent 12 years, he became the father of sorts to 4 children, lived off numerous welfare programs, including food stamps. He felt no pressure at all to work. He said, I knew the rent would be paid, I'd be fine, the kids wouldn't go hungry, I didn't have any desire to work. Wesley and his girlfriend never married, in part because that would have reduced their income from welfare. He stole goods that they wanted. He traded food stamps for drugs, a very common occurrence. When the police these days raid drug dealers' homes, they often find piles and piles of food stamps or things that look like credit cards these days that are for food stamps. Wesley started manufacturing and selling meth while he was on food stamps and welfare. He eventually went to prison, and then, as he says, God changed his thinking. He fell upwards. He came out after 3 years. He found a job. He's been employed for 4 years now. He criticizes use of food stamps for those capable of working. He says, they allow you to be irresponsible. They allowed me to be irresponsible, he says. Now, it's hard to know how many of the 46 million Americans now enrolled in SNAP are like Solis, using them for temporary help, and how many are like Wesley, using them as an aid to irresponsibility. But there's a huge difference between those two people and those two positions. It looks like the second group, the Wesleys, is increasing rapidly because more and more people are being enrolled in SNAP. And now states compete to increase the number of residents on food stamps, and journalists laud the winners. SNAP advocates, it's funny, they work to break down resistance from many among the elderly who are opposed to going on welfare, and then sometimes there are populations, the Amish in Ohio and Pennsylvania don't go on welfare. And there were executives who were ordered, get those people on welfare, and they faced resistance. And eventually they had to give up, and they were told, okay, in this particular situation, you can let them go, let the Amish go. But that's unusual. The drive is on to sign up more and more food stamp users. Organizations jump in with high-tech applications. The Greater Chicago Food Depository equipped food stamp outreach coordinators with Sprint 4G-powered laptops. They crisscross the county, going from food pantries to city agencies to churches to community centers, to speed up the sign-up process. So this easy availability of welfare costs taxpayers lots of money, but that, again, is not the real problem. The problem is that welfare sucks in millions of people. And once you get in, it's easy to just relax into the safety net that becomes somewhat of a hammock. It creates a dependent attitude with long-term detriment to them and their children. And then also, there are budgetary pressures these days, of course, and we are likely to end up with watery soup, with some desperately needy families not getting enough to provide good nutrition for their kids, because it's going to people who don't really need it. And even Americans on the political left realize that welfare in the U.S. is not fulfilling its initial mission of concentrating on those in need. I'll quote from our leading left-of-center newspaper, the New York Times, quote, "The government safety net was created to keep Americans from abject poverty, but the poorest households no longer receive a majority of government benefits. A secondary mission has gradually become primary, maintaining the middle class from childhood through retirement. The share of benefits flowing to the lowest quintile of people has decreased. It was most of the money, and now it's down to 36%, because people in the next lowest quintile, from the 21st to 40th percent, are getting onto welfare also, and they don't really need it, but they're getting it, and it hurts them, and then it hurts other people, and takes up money that people who really are in desperate need could use. So this is the problem. It's a problem. It's a financial problem, but even more than that, it's a problem in terms of human lives. There are other expansions that are going on, that have gone on, and that are going on. Well, and so many of these things start small, and they have very good intentions. The people who propose them have very good intentions, but then they gradually get larger and larger and bring in people who it can ruin their lives. I'll give you an example here. In 1972, Congress made disabled children eligible for a program called SSI. SSI is Supplemental Security Income. Americans can get an additional $700 per month if the Social Security Administration deems them unable to hold a job now or at some point in the future. And initially, the program was a way to help those physically disabled, but then it started expanding. One expansion came when the program started giving money to those who were disabled themselves by heavy drinking or drug use. I have a good friend who runs a homeless shelter in Denver, Bob Cote, and he talks about the alcoholics who get monthly governmental checks, they go on a binge and they freeze to death on the sidewalks in Denver winter. He sees this, I mean, close up as an enormous evil, hurting many more people than it helps. In 1972, Congress made disabled children eligible, and the goal is to help poor parents who lost wages by taking time off from work to care for children with muscular dystrophy or cerebral palsy. And the politicians spoke very eloquently and movingly of families having additional expenses, wheelchairs, taxi rides to hospitals, and so forth. So this initial idea was good. Then the psychologists asked, why not us? They argued that depression, mental depression, can be as disabling as a bad physical ailment, and that's true enough. But tests can show physical cancers. Psychological ones are often judgment calls, which means that some money seekers can game the system when they want the money that a diagnosis can generate. And hundreds of thousands of Americans have learned to game the system. Washington at one point decreed that at least 10% of preschoolers in Head Start, the government program for poor children, that at least 10% needed to be disabled. These are let's say, 4-year-olds. Well, that created an incentive to have more children so classified, an incentive by the people who run these programs, and sometimes an incentive on the part of the parents. There are 2 Massachusetts parents now in jail, the Rileys, because they overdosed their 4-year-old, Rebecca Riley, with a drug taken for treatment of bipolar disorders. The parents and their 2 older children were already receiving each $700 per month, $2,800 per month, suffering from mood swings and attention deficit disorder, and they wanted $700 more from Rebecca. And they overdosed her, and 4-year-old Rebecca died on the floor of her home. An extreme example, but there are other examples that occur when you set up a system where some people have incentives to make themselves not better but worse. That's an extreme case, but now there are 1 million children on SSI. And even the Boston Globe, which is on the left, says the government has gone too far. There was a Globe editorial noting that Americans used to have a can-do attitude, but welfare creates a slippery slope. So it's easy to slip from can-do to cannot, where in fact you try to make yourself sicker than you are. And that's where we are in the United States now. The danger is great. Again, not everyone, not most people, but some people, and as long as you keep expanding the barriers, expanding the borders, this is what happens. And so what's happening now? Let's turn to the future. Given current trends, it appears, there are projections from various professors that half of U.S. children are or will be in a household that uses food stamps during some point in their childhood. More than 90% of children with single parents will spend time in a household receiving food stamps. And again, as a temporary thing for people in desperate need, yes. As a permanent thing and training kids that this is where the money comes from, this is where the food comes from, it's enormously destructive. Well, there's a debate in the United States now about how we change that. How do you prevent a welfare society when most people become dependent on government for a dole? How do you stop accepting excuses where there are people who say, well, gee, there's no way I can get a job in today's economy. And that's just not true. At that Work-Faith Connection in Houston, there's one room they have with photos of more than 1,100 men and women who have graduated from their job readiness workshops over the past 4 years. Many and perhaps even most of those people are felons. They particularly work with people coming out of prison, and felons are statistically the least likely to be hired. But Work-Faith offers training. It helps people adjust their attitudes. And they've found that 78% of their graduates get a job. And most of them continue in that job for at least 1 year. They track them through that first year. Now, if felons can do it, then anyone can. There was a counselor at an anti-addiction program that I visited a few years ago. He had believed, and he also was very much on the left politically, he had believed that the poor are trapped within brick walls. This is a capitalist system. They're poor. They're stuck. There's nothing you can do. He worked as a counselor there for 7 years, and he learned, this is what he said, he learned that the walls are not brick, they're paper, and someone who wants to can punch right through. no matter how that person is messed up, there are still opportunities. There's a movie called Black Hawk Down, which I can recommend as a good action film, and there's a sergeant who tries to turn down an assignment by saying he's been shot. This is a group of US soldiers who are shot up in Somalia. He says, "I've been shot." The colonel replies, "Everybody's shot. Get in and drive." And that's exactly that was the thing in the movie, and that's really, I think, an attitude towards life in general. I mean, everyone's been shot in some way. Don't keep making excuses, get in and drive. There are some who are mentally or physically unable to punch, that's true, or drive. Some, but a small number of those who in the United States are now on welfare. There are some who need temporary emergency help, a larger number, but 46 million Americans and more each year. And the problem, again, I can't stress this enough, it's not the cost that's the chief problem. It's substantial, but it's not the cost that's the problem, it's the problem in lives. And if conservatives just talk about the cost, at least in the American experience, conservatives get nowhere. Not until you talk about lives and know the lives, spend time getting out in communities and learning and hearing stories and listening to the real lives of real people, the real stories of real people, then you don't get anywhere politically. The basic thing that changed American understanding was that we are all created in God's image. We're capable of doing great things. We should not be on welfare. US politics now, there's a huge divide. The left emphasizes government as the way to create change we can all believe in. The right emphasizes the individual. I tend to be more or less on the right, but I also see that if those are the only two choices, that lots of Americans will embrace big government. Representative Barney Frank from Massachusetts is often quoted as saying, "Government is simply the name we give the things we choose to do together." Well, as long as that's the only way to do things together, a lot of people will vote for more government, especially if they think they will prosper from it. The turning point is when we realize that there are other ways to, other names for the things we choose to do together. Civil society is one name. The independent sector or the nonprofit sector is another name. The problem, let me just say, is not just organizational, it's also personal. For a couple of years back in the 90s when I was trying to promote welfare reform, I was flying around the United States a lot. I accumulated enough frequent flyer miles to get free upgrades to first class very often. And I'd often get into a conversation with the person next to me and he would be complaining about taxes. And I'd say, okay, what if you could reduce your tax bill, but you'd have to spend a couple of hours a week on the other side of the tracks, helping a poor child learn to read or an ex-prisoner to stay out of trouble. Or if you're a doctor working at a clinic for the poor over there, and you could reduce your taxes in that way, but you'd have to volunteer several hours. Would you want to do it? Well, just about everyone said, well, given that choice, I'd rather pay more taxes. Time I don't have, I don't want to give up my time and do it in that way, okay, I'll pay more taxes. Going beyond the welfare state requires us individually and together to choose a different path. Civil society, non-governmental institutions, where people can work together to help their communities and cities flourish, often through volunteer efforts. My magazine, World, we are now having, for the 7th year in a row, a contest to find some of the most effective, compassionate ministries in the United States. We get nominations from our readers, and then we investigate them. We send reporters, and we investigate more, and then we run stories on the ones that are really doing good stuff. And I've visited a lot of these. They're phenomenal. They help children, homeless adults, ex-prisoners, ex-prostitutes, but not ex-human beings. I mean, here's the key thing. All people created in God's image, capable of doing wonderful things because we're created by a wonderful God. I flew here yesterday from Arizona, a similar climate. I talked there with many local poverty fighters from Christian organizations. And they changed lives, not through money, but by teaching people about God and about themselves. And whether you agree with what they say theologically or not, that is the prime way in the United States where people get off drugs and come out of poverty. The prime way in the United States to doing that is people coming to understand who they are in Christ. It's a religious thing, but it's a thing that works. And I've often talked with various government officials and said, here are these groups that are effective. You can either help them or you can hinder them. And the real question is, what do you hate more? Do you hate poverty more or do you hate God more? That's the question you're going to have to decide, because the groups that are effective, let me just tell you one story. On the Today Show, I don't know if some of you have seen it, an NBC network, kind of a morning talk show. There was the hostess a few years back who asked four people who had been on drugs for a long time and were now off drugs, what changed your life? And the first one says something like, oh, I praise my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And she's somewhat taken aback, turns to the second and says, well, what about you? And he's a little quieter, but he says, well, I came to believe in Christ, and then that changed my life. She turns to the third, he says the same thing. She turns to the fourth, and again, these were not people she had chosen for this purpose. These were just four people coming. She turns to the fourth and says, well, apart from Jesus, what changed your life? She was desperate for something else, but basically, this is what happens in the United States. And the problem is that the state, with its power to mandate and to tax, tends to crowd out the civil society competition. There is Gresham's law, you may be familiar with, bad money drives out good. In many ways, bad charity drives out good. Governmental charity sucks up the money, sucks up the time, and it really hurts these organizations that are far more effective in fighting poverty. Every tax dollar that the government takes is $1 that cannot go to charities and churches that have anti-poverty programs. Every person who has to work a second job to get money for his family because taxes are so high is one fewer potential volunteer. He really does not have the time. Every mother who would rather stay at home with her children and volunteer part-time, but instead needs to go out and work a full-time job, is one less pair of helping hands. So if we want to go beyond the welfare state, we need to shrink government so people have more time and money to contribute. And we've learned in the United States the dangers of a downward spiral. Government taxes more, people have less time and money, government responds to the new needs that are created when people don't have that time and their kids are running wild and all sorts of things, or government creates new ones and people have less time and money, it just spirals downward and downward and downward. How do you break that? Well, Wednesday evening in Phoenix, I was with a husband and wife who have a 14-year-old autistic child. That is so hard. I mean, it just floors me. It is so hard. They have to watch their autistic child every moment. They don't get the positive feedback that I've been blessed to get from my own kids. Many parents, I think most parents in the United States in that situation, turn the child over to the government. They say, we can't do it. 80% of fathers in the United States, when they're autistic children, eventually leave. They just can't take it. It is so, so hard. I mean, these parents, they stick with it, and the reason they stick with it, they are right out front in saying that, is because they believe in Christ, they believe that Christ sacrificed for them, and it is their calling to sacrifice for others. That's the only thing that keeps them going day after day through this incredibly hard work of caring for their autistic child who's now 14 years old. That's the history of America. The poverty fighters, as I sat in the Library of Congress and did research on the poverty fighters from previous generations, what excited them? What got them going? I read one account of a person who basically got involved because he read chapter 5 of the Gospel according to John. He reads there about Jesus talking directly to a man who had been an invalid for 38 years and was used to spending his days by a pool in Bethesda. Jesus asks him, do you want to get well? And the man responds, I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. So here the man had very limited expectations. I'm going to sit by the pool. I'm going to go in when the water is stirred. This is my life. It's always going to be my life. It's been my life for 38 years. And Jesus loves the man by giving him not what he expected, maybe some money, maybe helping him into the pool, but something that would radically change his life. He says, get up, pick up your mat, and walk. He tells the invalid to become a responsible member of society. Now, you know, none of us has the power to just say, pick up your mat and walk in that way, in this miraculous way. But we do have the power to say to people, we're going to help you become a responsible, independent person again. We're going to push you in that way. We're going to prod you a little bit. We're not going to just let you stay here and be dependent year after year after year if there's an opportunity that you can be otherwise. Patience, faith to become independent. I've seen over the past 20 years just some amazing, miraculous things that I never would have expected. That's what Americans in previous generations believed in, fighting an effective war on poverty. That's what a lot of people in the United States still believe in right now. That's the only way we're going to be able to decrease the size of the welfare state. I don't know what you all are going to do here in Canada, but our experience is, whether you like it or not, our experience is that God changes lives. And without that, we're lost. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Olasky. It's greatly appreciated your words today. Our responder today is almost needs no introduction at all. Michael Korn is somebody that we've watched on television. We've read his columns. He has numerous books to his credit as well. And so I'll bring him forward for a time of response right now. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you. You can clap. It's okay. We haven't got too much time, so just a couple of questions. The notion of welfare dependency, I want to reverse that. I don't mean the welfare recipient being dependent on the state. I mean the state being dependent on the welfare recipient at two levels, both emotionally, for good reasons. People within the state, within government, within the bureaucracy think they're doing the right thing and they can't break out of that mindset. But also from a more malicious standpoint, and that is, if people depend on you, they will vote for you. And whether it's Britain, Canada, the US, or continental Europe, the state and welfare is seen as a party of the Liberal or Social Democratic Party. So how do we get out of that point of view, and if you like, liberate and empower people who up to now have been on welfare? I'll do one at a time, otherwise you'll get terribly confused.
No,
Go on. Okay, well, the second one is, look, and I speak here as a Christian, but the language that was used, it was music to my ears, but Canada is a different country from the United States of America, and any conservative politician here will tell you that once you use the context of even something as innocuous as made in the image of God, and when you mention Christianity and faith, it opens the door for all sorts of very, very, very intelligent, fair, I'm joking here, objective people in media to say, that's interesting. In other words, they will try to crucify you, forgive the pun. So in Canadian politics, in the Canadian public square, and people are trying to change this, but if you do mention people being made in the image of God, and the only real alternative to welfare dependency is something with a strong faith imperative, you do open yourself up to all sorts of attacks. And what tends to happen is the debate is not expanded, the debate is closed down. So the language, the vocabulary is very important. So that's another observation. And the last one will be this. We don't have in this country the underclass, if you like, and I hope that doesn't sound too pejorative. We don't have the underclass that you do have in the United States of America. We do have multi-generational welfare dependency, but to nothing like the same extent. We do have parts of the country that have welfare as part of the fabric of their way of life, but it's minimal compared to south of the border. So with your knowledge of Canada, do you think we really face the same problems, the same predicament, as you do in the United States?
Could you define your first question a little more?
Define the first question a little more? Oh, I've forgotten what that is. The first question was we hear about welfare dependency, and we always assume it's the recipient being dependent on welfare. But I think that frequently the state is dependent on the recipient. And that is, you create a dependent class, so their support for you, their votes will go to you. And whether it's this country or the United States or Europe, Britain, the party of welfare is invariably thought to be, almost exclusively thought to be, either liberal or social democratic. The Labour Party in Britain, the Democrats in the United States, and still to a large extent, the Liberals or the NDP in Canada. So is it in the self-interest, if you like, of parties of the left to make sure that, not in a malicious way perhaps, but to make sure that there is a large class of people who are dependent on the generosity of the state?
Yes, I've just been warned. Short response, please. And so, no, the problem of a political grouping that is highly dependent on expansion of the welfare state is a very difficult problem, and that's why in the United States our experience from 1995 to 2000 of actually being able to shrink the welfare state is a real anomaly. the tendency is for the welfare state to grow because of exactly that reason, that there are thousands and tens of thousands of people in politics and government who depend on that. How to change that? I don't have a good answer. What happened in the United States in those 5 years was, I think, to a large extent, dependent on or involved with this idea of it just wasn't right. It wasn't so much power politics anymore. It was just, this just isn't right. It's not helpful to the people being helped. This first, and I will keep this short, but one story. I mean, here's what really opened my eyes was going around once in Atlanta, being shown around by a local African-American leader who went around pointing to the various government buildings, this welfare building, this building, that building, and saying, that's the enemy. This is what keeps us, and this again is in American history, this is what keeps us on the welfare plantation. It's a new form of slavery. And unless that was understood by people, not just conservatives, but by some people on the left as well, we did not have the critical mass for welfare reform. But there was a brief period in American history where that was understood. I think we've probably moved away from that now. How do we move back to it? You know, when we have such a dependent class of politicians, I don't want to keep repeating this, but it's a Christian sensibility, shared by many Orthodox Jews in the United States, and by some Muslims as well. But a sense is this just isn't right. We are treating people as animals. We're putting food in their bowls, scratching them on the stomach the way I would do with my dogs, and letting them lie around. It's just not right. That's what it came down to. Not dollars and cents, but it's just not right.
Dr. Olasky, thank you for your thoughts, your insights, your challenges to us here on this interesting topic today. Michael, thank you for your insights as well in bringing that to life for us as well. Just remind you that for those with your smartphones, oh, it's not up there right now, but there is a poll for this session as well, and I would encourage you to take the time to do that. We have pushed up and past our time right now for questions, so I'm going to ask the gentleman if we'll turn over to the next session here, but if you have questions individually for Dr. Olasky or Michael Korn, we'll step over to the side and let you ask a few questions here, but we'll let the next session move on from now. Thank you very much for your attendance this afternoon, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.